I feel like I should be
They heard
that's a
about you,
little
David.
insulting. Like if they're like,
Reputation.
that David Deutsch.
That
Oh,
David
It's
Deutsch.
not a,
I thought it was the Oxford physics professor.
David, one of my vendors where I work, his name is David Deutsch. He works for Corner Hardware Supplies.
Yeah. He's,
Family
he's, he's, he's the David Deutsch who's useful to the world.
yeah. When I saw it said David Deutsch, I was wondering maybe this is what he does at night. I don't know.
Yeah.
How many David Deutsches are there?
You know what? You would be
A lot.
surprised. It is a strangely common name in the New York area.
Yeah.
I guess so. I guess it is.
And again, there is this son of a bitch Oxford professor who he really takes like all the David Deutsch oxygen in the world. I'm glad to see you, Joel. There will be a reference to Canadian Army hero veterans. So
yes, Joel. Hi.
hi, how are you?
all right.
Great.
So I guess we'll get crack-a-lock in here. All right. So just so I can see my screen, I will not necessarily see everybody if you put your hand up or whatever. So if you want to ask something, say something, feel free to interrupt, and I will happily allow you to. So last week we got through the let's say about 1942 or so, right? And the point at which the majority of the Yishuv had accepted the premise that they would fight the white papers if there is no war, and fight the wars if there is no white paper. But even before the end of World War II, the revisionist elements in the Yishuv start to prepare for independence, or for the fight for independence, right? Particularly as it's become apparent once it's clear that the British are going to win. So the leader of this, and one of the most obviously important figures in Israeli history, is a guy who just arrives in Palestine during the war itself, Menachem Begin. So Begin, seen here in his NKVD mugshots, he had fled Poland to Lithuania after the Germans invaded in 1941. 1940. The Soviets take over Lithuania. There is a mass arrest of Polish exiles, Zionists, right, various figures who were politically problematic for the Soviets. He gets sent to a gulag, which he discusses in his book White Nights. And then in 1941, after the Soviets are invaded, the Polish government in exile works at a deal with the Soviets, a general amnesty for Polish prisoners. The idea is they will be released from the gulag and they can make their way to the Middle East, where a Polish army in exile is being established by the British. And wonder of wonders, miracle of miracles, where exactly in the Middle East is this Polish army being formed? Palestine, right? So it's not like you get a free trip. A lot of these people had to migrate very, very difficult terrain through the Soviet Union by train, by land, by walking, whatever it is, eventually getting to Iran, and then the British provided transport to Palestine. And so Menachem Begin lands in wartime Palestine. Jabotinsky's just died. David Raziel, I mentioned last week, was killed in a military operation on behalf of the British in Iraq in 1941. And Begin is sort of like the biggest fish they have, right? He had been the leader of Beitar in Poland right before the war broke out. So one of the more prominent figures in the national revisionist movement, or the New Zionist Organization. And he's asked to take over the Irgun. He agrees to do so. He receives permission from the Polish authorities to take a permanent leave. This is one of those things which became sort of like a contentious point for Begin, who again had a certain degree of sort of like old school honor about him, right? That he wanted to make it clear that he did not desert the Polish army, but had received permission from the Polish army, which is not implausible. One of the things I mentioned last week is that the Polish military was actually on pretty good terms with the revisionist movement, had long been involved in training revisionist youth for militias in Palestine and so forth. So plausible enough. There's Begin with his wife Eliza before he left the Polish army. Now, February 1944, right, at which point it's pretty clear the war is going the Allies' way, right before the Normandy invasion, but the Allies have already landed in Italy and so forth. He declares the beginning of an uprising against British rule. Declares that there's no longer any armistice between the Jewish people and the British administration, quote, which, hands our brothers over to Hitler. The Irgun is joined by Leahy, and they form a unified, right, Jewish underground and begin a campaign of violence against the British administration. Irgun tends to blow up British police stations and administrative offices, records, taxes, all this stuff. Leahy tends to focus on murdering British police officers. And worth keeping in mind, not a small number of those were Jews, right? As far as Leahy was concerned, number one, a member of the Palestine police is a member of the Palestine police, and they get killed. And from their perspective, if anything, a Jewish policeman in the service of the British is a collaborator, and certainly deserves death as well. In late 1944, Leahy assassinates Lord Moyne in Cairo. Anybody recall who Lord Moyne was? Know who Lord Moyne was? Yeah, Lord Moyne was the sort of overall British administrative official in the Middle East, right? Like commissioner of the Middle East or something like that. He was a member of the Guinness brewing family, and a personal friend of Winston Churchill. So the assassination of Moyne was, a big move for them, one which, strategically created problems, right? At that point, the Haganah decides that the British say to the Haganah, basically, you guys need to get your people under control. The Haganah begins a period, I think my slides are a bit out of order here, begins a period which will be known as the season. Interesting. I seem to be missing a slide. Oh, well. The season, or the hunting season, in which they begin hunting down Irgunists. Number one on their list is Menachem Begin, who spends months sort of if you'll pardon the pardon the expression, spends months, well, that's not in Mufti, that's civilian terms, spends month in disguise. He assumes the guise of a Rabbi Yisrael Sassover. So sometimes walking around in public as a rabbi, sometimes in hiding as this rabbi, but manages to evade British and Haganah arrests. At a time where, again, a lot of younger Irgunists are being arrested, being beaten by the Haganah, being turned over to the British. And by the end of 1945, with the war over, the Haganah now joins with the Irgun and Leahy in a united, right, Jewish military organization, which culminates in July 1946 with the Jewish underground's biggest success, the bombing of the King David Hotel. And I want to point out, right, the wing that they bombed was not serving as a hotel. It was serving as British military headquarters in Palestine at the time. Arguably, the targeting of it was pushed by the Haganah, because the British had recently captured a whole lot of records that would have implicated the Haganah in anti-British activities. A lot of civilians were killed, though. Right. I mean, the Irgun claims that they issued a warning shortly before the bombing. The British claim they didn't get the warning. Right. Who knows? The Irgunists had brought in bombs disguised in milk cans. Right. Those big milk cans that used to be used. I think 90-something people were killed, a mix of British, Jews, and Arabs. And I think it's worth sort of just discussing, this question, what is terrorism, right? I mean, to some extent, we can say, like, well, a terrorist is a guerrilla who kills people we don't want killed. A guerrilla is a terrorist who kills people we want to have killed. What's a legitimate target, right? I mean, certainly I would say that the King David Hotel was a perfectly legitimate target, right? It was serving as a British military headquarters. Irgun and Leahy did launch attacks on military targets. They also launched attacks on civilian targets. Certainly killed plenty of Arab civilians. They launched attacks on targets that might be civilian, might be military, right? And then what is a police officer, for example? Is that military or civilian? Is there a difference if that police officer is on duty or at home on leave, or if that police officer is, right, 2,000 miles away in England at the time, right? So Leahy wasn't just killing or trying to kill British officers in Palestine itself. Leahy actually launched a letter bomb campaign against British officials in England. There was talk at the highest levels of Leahy, which at that point included Yitzhak Shamir, of trying to assassinate Winston Churchill. Right, by almost any stretch of what we consider to be terrorism, right? Both Irgun and Leahy were certainly involved in terrorism, which, by my reckoning, well, great, because they helped win Israel. But I do think that, you know, these are things that if you are really interested in honest sort of awareness of Israel and Israeli history, we need to be aware of. There is a question as to how effective the Jewish underground was. There are two sort of approaches. One argument is that, that really the underground didn't really do much, right? Because the British were going to leave anyway. And there is an argument to be made that in 1947, Britain leaves India. The Labour government is doing a general drawdown of imperial forces. And, you know, that without India, there really was no reason to be in Palestine, right? Why were the British theoretically in Palestine in the first place? Anyone take a stab? Like, what was the British strategic value of Palestine?
Oil.
Pipelines to the rest of the Middle East.
Okay, well, that's got to be a thing, right? Certainly the pipeline of Haifa is going to be a big deal, but even earlier than that, right? Because that's not built until a little later. So not oil, but another fluid in the Middle East, very important. If you're the Royal Navy, very important.
Water.
Okay, Suez, right? The concern is that if the British don't take Palestine, then maybe the French will take Palestine, and they could threaten the approach to the Suez Canal. So, and why was the Suez Canal so important? India, right? So by the logic there, if India is no longer a jewel in the crown, right, maybe consider pawning off some of the other, right, pieces of jewelry there too. And there's an argument to be made for that. But I would say that the fact is that, you know, we don't have to make this a hypothetical, right? Even with the British withdrawal from India, and even with Labour trying to cut costs, the British don't just abandon their empire, right? And in the Middle East in particular, right, in the Eastern Mediterranean, the British were still in Cyprus into the early 1960s, in large part because, right, they still, right, I think it was Henry Atchison said the British have lost an empire and failed to find a role, right? The British were still trying to figure out what Britain is going to be in this post-war world, and they hadn't decided that they were losing their empire, right? There's a lot of discussion about the new empire and what important pieces would maintain there. And even today, in fact, I didn't realize this until I was preparing for this class, Britain actually still controls parts of Cyprus, right? That is part of their agreement when they left Cyprus, sort of like the way the United States controls Guantanamo Bay. The British still actually have two military territories in Cyprus that they still control. So the fact is, had the Zionist underground not made British occupation untenable, there's no reason why the British would have left in 48. They would have left when they could no longer afford to stay there anymore. And for the British, I would think too, it's not just blood and treasure that's causing them to leave Palestine. Blood and treasure were significant, right? Hundreds of British soldiers have been killed since 1945. The British were maintaining a force of 120,000 some personnel in Palestine, which, you know, it was probably the largest area, like the largest army of occupation the British had at that point, probably outside of
Weren't they
Germany.
interested in any archaeology or any history of?
Well, individual British officers were. I mean, keep in mind the British officer corps at this point still tended to be, people from Cambridge and Oxford, and a lot of these guys were, sort of remarkable autodidacts. And they were very interested in this stuff. I mean, last week we learned about Ord Wingate. Certainly had his own things, but yeah, British officers had often been everywhere the British went, sort of cutting edge on British science, on British archaeology. So there'd really long been a very intimate link between British military ventures and British scientific ventures and archaeological ventures. But that's not going to keep you in Palestine, right? With yeah.
Well, maybe they have a Jewish background and go back to, Noah's days.
Yeah. Right. Well, again, might be good enough for an individual officer. I don't think anybody's going to make a speech in Parliament justifying staying there because of all the oil lamps they're going to be finding.
Is there any correlate? I mean, the Ralph Richardson character in Exodus, the humane British commander of Palestine, who his men even are accusing of being part Jewish, although he says, is there any? Can you hear me?
Yeah. So,
is there any historical basis for him, or is he a made-up character?
It's been a long time since the movie. I assume the guy was based on General Stockwell. So we'll talk a little more about that later. But it's an interesting thing. The fact is, in 1948, 1947, both the Jews and the Arabs believed that the British favored the other side. And the fact is, you had both. I mean, certainly you had plenty of British soldiers who were pretty anti-Zionist and anti-Jewish by the end of the occupation, and from their perspective, not unreasonably, right? Because they're seeing their buddies blown up. But you still certainly had British soldiers, British officers as well, who were favorably inclined to the Zionists. So this General Stockwell, for example, someone famously gave the Zionists like a 2-day notice before the British pulled out of Haifa to allow them to sort of get, in position so that when the British left, they could quickly sort of move in on the areas the British were leaving. So there were certainly characters like that, yeah. And we'll talk about some of them as well today and next week. So certainly, the occupation and the resistance was costing the British blood and treasure, but it's costing them something else as well. And I think it's worth keeping in mind here, right? It's 1947. The British Army and the British see themselves as fair, as honorable, and as heroes, right? They just sacrificed a huge amount, again, talk about blood and treasure, to defeat Hitler. They see themselves in the role of being a fair, right, adjudicator for the conflict in Palestine. In the face of terrorism and thuggishness. And in the eyes of the world, when you look at things like Exodus 1947, right, they're the villains. Right, the British see themselves as playing cricket, as representing Western honesty and decency and a British virtue, and they will turn on the radio and pick up a newspaper, and all they see is the British are crushing the dreams of the Zionists. The British are taking, concentration camp survivors and sending them back to Germany, and if this sounds at all familiar, right, when you get frustrated at how Israel is portrayed, well, guess what? In 1947, to the British, the Zionist underground were the terrorists, and the British were the good guys who are being depicted as the villains. And one big difference, though, is that Israel doesn't have much choice in this conflict, right? The British did, and didn't have to put up with it anymore, and give things over to the UN. And one of the things that Begin was extremely good at was theater. He performed brilliant political theater in Palestine in 1947. demonstrate to demonstrate to the world and the British that they're not in control, right? So, at one point, for example, some young Jewish men were flogged by British officers. Begin had his men capture, kidnap, and flog some British officers, right? And put out the word like, you can't flog Jewish men in our land. If you're going to do that, right, we're going to do it to you. And the British stopped the floggings. But in 1947, the theater went on a little too long. Some of you are familiar with this, that death sentence has been passed on a number of Irgunists. Begin ordered 2 British NCOs to be captured and threatened to kill them if the Irgunists were killed. When the Irgunists were executed, Begin executed these British NCOs. I should point out, we're not guilty of anything other really than being British NCOs in Palestine. And in the wake of this, there's a wave of anti-Jewish violence in a number of British cities, most notably Manchester. But it's an interesting thing, like, again, just to stop and think about when we think of language today, right? Who here has heard, for example, Gilad Shalit having been kidnapped, right? I've certainly heard that language being used, right? Now, by any sort of military standard, he was a soldier on duty, taken prisoner. What happened after he was taken prisoner is something else entirely, right? But is that a legitimate target? Is a stabbing an IDF soldier on patrol in Hebron, and you may recall again a few years ago when there was that Israeli soldier who shot and killed an injured prisoner that the IDF had. I think Elor Rosario was the soldier's name, right? And said, oh, well, his friends have been stabbed by 2 terrorists, right? Again, is it terrorism to stab soldiers on patrol? Like, would we say that a member of the French resistance who shot a German soldier was engaging in terrorism or guerrilla warfare, right? I would never call that guy a terrorist. So I do think, again, it's an interesting thing when we think about language and how we present things. Again, whatever your politics are, I do think that we can be honest enough to recognize we all see a value in killing people when we have a goal that we want to have accomplished, right?
Timothy McVeigh, in an American context.
Yeah.
What's his name? Gore Vidal. He tried to excuse Timothy McVeigh. He saw Timothy McVeigh as quote unquote an anarchist, and Gore Vidal was a socialist. So he said when he blew up the federal building in Oklahoma, it was an act of resistance against the government. I mean, I find that
I would raise an interesting question about that. So is there a difference, let's say, between an act of resistance against a democracy in which you have a say, right, in which you technically have a means of changing the rules without that, versus an act of resistance against the government, which you don't have a say, right? I mean, I would argue that there's something different about that.
Although from McVeigh's standpoint, not to play devil's advocate, he was probably so alienated that he thought he didn't have a say. He was so.
No, I understand that, right? I mean, the Jews control everything, right? I'm just pointing out that on some level, though, there is a right. Look, there's something you could say, oh, that's wrong, right? You blow up a school, that's bad, right? But there's a whole lot of gray areas, and I do think certainly that in terms of how the language we use, for example, in Israel, I was a soldier. Soldiers on duty are it's not terrorism, right? You might not like the guerrilla warfare involved, but it's because you don't like the target. But there is a fundamental difference between targeting soldiers, whether it's a British soldier on patrol in 1947 or an Israeli soldier on patrol in 2023. Sorry, Paul, did you want to say something?
Yeah, no, I mean, a point well taken. I'm just wondering if we need to remember the context and the trauma of the Churban of the Shoah. Okay, not as only its impact on Jews, but its impact on non-Jews, and which is the vilification, as it were, of Britain. Britain was the bad object for the world, There were many accomplices to Britain when it came to the destruction of Jews. And, I'm just wondering if that's something we need to be mindful of.
Well, but that's the sort of thing, right? Everybody who engages in this has a trauma that they go through that they feel people should be mindful of, right? I mean, you ask a Palestinian living in Gaza or the West Bank, right?
Yeah.
They have, quite frankly, a whole history of their own families and their own traumas and feelings
Right.
about, right? So, yeah. Again, I don't. This is not like where I'm coming up with a statement of one thing or another. I just think it's interesting things that you need to think about.
Right. No, I think it's a very good point. I think.
Yeah.
Be mindful.
Yeah. Also, look, I think, and again, I'll tell you what. You ask a British soldier who was on patrol in 1947. Most of them were not going to be particularly philosophical about the subject. I also think it's interesting looking forward. Because I think one of the things that is interesting, again, Israel is a country which is very much shaped by a series of military experiences, is the role that the Irgun is going to play in shaping future politics in Israel, particularly the connection between non-Ashkenazim and the Likud, right? That if you look at the first few decades of Israeli historiography and the sort of the heroic historiography of Zionism, it was largely an Ashkenazi narrative, right? It was a narrative spun generally by the labor movement, which did not have a lot of non-Ashkenazi heroes in a military capacity there. Irgun, by contrast, and Lehi drew significantly on Jews from the Muslim world. And I want to take a guess. Well, again, it wasn't like a racist thing. Why do you think there were relatively few non-Ashkis in the Haganah and Palmach?
I think there were some racist aspects.
Oh, there are going to be a lot of racist aspects when you talk about the big migration in the late 1940s and early 1950s. I'm saying but before that happens, right? There's something more practical.
What
There was
years
a
are you
dearth
talking about?
of Edom Mizrach. There was a dearth of Jews from the Orient.
Oh yeah, well, but Irgun and Lehi found it. So the question is not were they there, but where were they looking, right? Where were a lot of the Palmachniks and Haganahniks being recruited from?
Kibbutz, like Palmach was from Herzliya.
Perfect. Okay, good. So this becomes one of these things where there's a kind of, just look. It's like in Willie Sutton, Wadi Ra Banks. That's where the money is, right? The Haganah and Palmach were generally drawing from kibbutznikim, from the pioneers, all these groups, and those kibbutzim were generally set up by Ashkis. Irgun and Lehi, by contrast, tended to draw from urban populations where you had a mix of Ashkis and Sephardim and Mizrahim, which brought them in. And again, some of it might have been a matter of tradition and religion, these other things. But it did play a role later on that by the 1970s, when the Sephardim and Mizrahi populations are looking for sort of like a usable history for themselves, they could look at Begin and look at Shamir and look at these movements and say, hey, right, this is our history. Yeah, right. This is something that we played a role in, like we were here too. So again, something to ponder for later on. Now, whatever exactly motivated the British in 1947, they gave up the mandate to the UN. UN votes for partition on November 29th. The next day, a busload of Jews comes in to attack near Jaffa, which is either the first blood of the Civil War or just the continuation of the violence that was happening already. But either way, the partition plan is a disaster, right? Because look at it. Right? I mean, it's the sort of thing where if you're going to say, how could we make a divide this place up in a way guaranteed to cause a disaster, or like this is it. And it was, I'm not saying they could have done a better job, right? The reality is they were trying to deal with a demographic reality. Their main goal was to create a Jewish state with a demographic majority of Jews, and one that would be economically viable. So, bunch of Jews here, bunch of Jews there, bunch of Jews there. The Negev didn't have many Jews at all, but they figured it'd help increase the viability of the state. But this is pretty much the best that they could do given where the Jews were living. And even with this, the Jewish population only 55%. Right. The assumption was as soon as the state was created, they would bring in another 600,000 Jews from Europe. Right at this point, the population of the issue of Palestine, about 600,000 Jews, 1.2 million non-Jews. Right. And about 100,000 Jews, so one sixth of the Jewish population, was living in Jerusalem, which was in the heart of the Arab sector. And was supposed to be some kind of international city, whatever exactly that would mean. Now, however this is going to work out, from the end of November through the middle of May, it is understood on the Jewish side of things that independence is coming, a war is coming, the war is actually already there, and there are three distinct rival groups that they need to take into consideration, right? Palestinian Arabs, Arab states, and the British. So let's look at each one of these. So Palestinian Arabs, there was very little in terms of Palestinian Arab leadership. The failure of the Arab revolt had led a lot of Arab leaders to flee. A number of important ones like Fawzi al-Kokji and the Mufti ended up in Germany right during the war. The traditional notable leaders, right, the old families, were certainly not unified. They had their own rivalries. And the fact is, there was no voice of the Palestinian Arab people. There was no organization that represented the Palestinian Arab people. And there was no unified response. I mean, if you'd asked the average Palestinian Arab in 1947, what do you feel about partition? They would have been opposed to it. But that didn't mean they necessarily did anything about it, right? And one of the things that's interesting to see is that, as a rule, despite all the talk of Palestinian unity and so forth, if you were a Palestinian Arab living in a village that was nowhere near a Jew, chances are you weren't getting involved in this conflict, right? Not if you could avoid it, right? Large numbers of Palestinian Arabs did not get involved, didn't have to get involved. As for those that wanted to, there was something formed called the Organization for Holy Struggle, which was supposed to be a Palestinian army led by a guy named Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini, was the most dynamic and popular of the Arab Palestinian Arab leaders. By the spring of 1948, they only had a few thousand members, poorly trained, poorly armed. Most villages had some guys with guns, but again, not particularly good weapons nor much training. The Arab world, a lot of bombast, a lot of discussion about how the Jews are really in for it now. But the reality is, despite the rhetoric, most of the leaders of the Arab world were not particularly enthusiastic about going to war with the Zionists. They had relatively few doubts about their own shortcomings. They had their concerns about the preparations the Zionists had made. Both sides tended to overestimate the other, right? So if you look as much as you can't get much from the Arab side, but from the Jewish side. Each side looked at the other and thought they had more tanks, more planes, more weapons, right? More manpower. So you had Arab leaders who knew that their armies were poorly prepared, and they assumed that the Zionists were much better prepared. And it does seem that for much of this period, the states hoped they would not have to get involved. A lot of rhetoric and a small amount of money was spent in organizing something called the Arab Liberation Army, which was supposed to be a group of volunteers who would go in and save Palestine from the Jews, led by a guy named Fawzi al-Kokji, who is again sort of interesting figure. He started off as an officer in the Ottoman army from Tripoli, Lebanon. He'd fought against the French in Syria. He fought against the British and Zionists in Palestine. He fought against the British in Iraq. He ends up in Nazi Germany doing propaganda. So he's sort of like a career Arab revolutionary. But again, at their most, about 6,000 men, little training, few arms. And one of the things complicating the idea of the Arab response is there wasn't one idea of what the Arabs should be doing, right? We'll talk more about individual states later, but over the course of the previous 30 years, two distinct forms of Arab nationalism had developed, right? So in like 1914, Arab nationalism meant pan-Arabism, right? One Arab state. But the partitions that had taken place under British and French rule in the mandate system had led to the creation of individual forms of Arab nationalism. So you no longer had like the dream of a unified Arab state. You had Syrian nationalists and Transjordanian nationalists and Iraqi nationalists and Lebanese nationalists and Egyptian nationalists, and they're different things. And some of those things were actually quite contrary to one another. So hold that thought. And
Can I ask a question?
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
sorry. The usual propaganda myth, call it what you will, is that
Yeah.
the Israeli state was doomed upon the partition because it was 500,000 Jews surrounded by 50 million Arabs. So
Yeah.
are you saying that's rhetoric because the 50 million Arabs were never able to act with any unison?
Yeah. So you know what? I'm going to put a pin in that because we're going to go into that some detail a little later on. Okay. And I want to apologize, boy. Like I realized, like this class and last week's are going to be the longest ones. Like, especially like 2 weeks from now, 6-day war, that'll be a snap, right? But these two classes are covering a lot of material. So I apologize, but hopefully you'll get something out of it. The British are the last sort of variable here. The British were done with Palestine, but the British aren't leaving until the middle of May. The British do take their responsibilities seriously, for all of the bitterness at how things have worked out. They're still trying to be sort of relatively fair referees in this. And the Zionists need to do a very careful arithmetic here. They need to calculate, right, how many British are still here, how long is it till the end of the mandate, who is in command of this particular British unit or not, right? So, they for the first few months, the Zionists have to be very, very hesitant because too forceful an action on their part might lead to a British response. And certainly there are no shortage of British troops and personnel who do want to, get some payback against the Zionists. So a lot of what the Zionists are doing are waiting until the British have drawn down to the point where they're not going to do much about it, right? I mean, and it's kind of goes back, I think it was is it John Kerry said it or somebody back during the 1970s, like how do you tell a man to go and fight for a mistake, right? I mean, whether it's the U.S. drawing down in Vietnam or Israelis drawing down in Lebanon or us drawing down in Afghanistan or the British drawing down here, at some juncture, when everybody knows this is over, right? Do you as a soldier want to go out and die for something that's done with? Do you as a commander want to send your young men out to die for something which is done with? So, you got to wait for that, moment, but it comes. And both, as I was saying before, and as I said about Ralph Richardson, both sides tended to view the British as favoring the other side. And I think it's a credit to the British that that's the impression, right? I mean, certainly you had commanders and individuals who favored one side or the other. When the British leave, you are going to have certainly more British deserters who fight against the Zionists than you have British deserters who fight for the Zionists. There might be 20, maybe a couple dozen British soldiers who stay and fight on the Zionist side, maybe 100 or 200 who stay and fight on the Arab side. In both cases, a lot of things had to do with, like, if they had girlfriends, Jewish or Arab girlfriends, that affected them. But the British, try and play fair for most of this time. By March, though, it's pretty clear that it's time to move, right? That the mandate is coming to an end in mid-May. The time has come for the Yishuv to begin taking offensive action to prepare for whatever is going to come next. And they don't know what's going to come next, right? The assumption on their part is there will be some kind of invasion from the Arab world. And to do that, you need to prepare, not just take over land, but take over roads, bridges, railway tunnels, whatever it may be, strategic villages and so forth, which leads in March to the issue in what's called Tachnid Dalet, Plan D. Which The objective of this plan is to gain control of the areas of the Hebrew state and defend its borders. It also aims at gaining control of the areas of Jewish settlement and concentration, which are located outside the borders, against regular, semi-regular, and small forces operating from bases outside or inside the state. So we have to go on the offensive to seize control of areas that are going to be necessary for holding the state against various enemies. Generally, the aim of this plan is not an operation of occupation outside the borders of the Hebrew state. However, concerning enemy bases lying directly close to the borders, which may be used as springboards for infiltration in the territory of the state, these must be temporarily occupied and searched for hostiles. Now, up to this point, it seems more or less against military stuff. Here is the controversial part. Destruction of villages, setting fire to, blowing up and planting mines in the debris, especially those population centers which are difficult to control continuously, mounting search and control operations according to the following guidelines, ensure command of the village and conducting a search inside it. In the event of resistance, the armed force must be destroyed and the population must be expelled outside the borders of the state. Now, this has come down in anti-Zionist rhetoric as being the blueprint for ethnic cleansing, right? And in the way it's generally presented, this is the culmination of decades-long Zionist planning to expel the population of Arabs from Palestine. And certainly, look, the question of transfer, as the sort of politically correct term for expulsion was called, was one that was raised by some of the prominent figures in the Zionist movement. But there was no consistent plan or strategy. And in fact, before World War II, even most of the Zionist right would have argued that expulsion isn't necessary, right? Because once we have a state, we've got millions of Jews who are going to come in and create a new demographic reality, right? We don't need to expel Palestinians because we will simply create a Jewish majority, or expel Arabs, I should say. Now, the murder of those Jews obviously changes the calculus of some of these people and makes it more imperative. But the reality is, Tachlit is not an overall plan. It is largely left up to local commanders, right? So individual commanders, if you feel this particular village is a threat, take actions. And when you look at what happens, that's what takes place, right? There are places where Arabs are expelled and villages are destroyed. There are places where there aren't. Does it make things less tragic? But certainly there is no evidence of there being a long-term strategy for this, nor of this being the culmination of that. And April, so the Tachlit Dalet is issued in March, but it's really April where it goes into effect, particularly around Jerusalem. And again, if you look at the map, you can see Jerusalem is 100,000 Jews, and it's Jerusalem, and it is under siege. There are efforts made to cut food and water to Jerusalem, and again, many of us have been to Jerusalem, and you go that road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and this is what it looked like back then, right? It wasn't a big, like 6-lane highway. It was, one good lane maybe. And to get from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, you had to travel through a whole lot of hostile territory dominated by Arab villages. And even before the mandate was ended, Jerusalem was basically out of food and water. Beginning of April, the Yishuv, or the higher ups, order an operation designed to open the roads to Jerusalem. And there are a whole series of Arab villages, right, that are across the road that need to be dealt with. There are two in particular that we will discuss. One is Castel, one is Der Yassin. And a lot of you have probably been to Castel. If you haven't, highly recommend it. It's an amazing piece of history that I as a giant nerd, I love it when you have these places where you can actually see what people would have seen. So Castel is a village. It's near anybody know the Mevatzeret, the mall, right? So on one side of the road there's Mevatzeret, Zion, right, the mall and Yeshiva. On the other side you have Castel, which is now expanded as a Jewish village. So you had an old Crusader fort on top of this hill. That's why it's called Castel, right? The castle. And basically from this hill, you could look down, and again, it stood on the hill. You can look down and see the road that, right, Jewish Jewish provisions would have had to pass through. And you would have had Arab spotters on these roads. When they saw a caravan of trucks or a convoy coming by, they'd give out the warning, boulders would be rolled down on the road to block it. And Arab villagers, militia would be called in to attack these things. So on April 3rd, Palmach occupies the village. They hold it for several days in the face of again, severe Arab counterattacks. And then in the early morning of April 8th, you have a bunch of Palmachniks who are on the hill. And they hear somebody calling out in English, "Hello, boys," Arabic accented English. And one of the Jewish soldiers opens fire, right? He figures this guy's an Arab, has stumbled into our positions, little realizing who he's killed. And in the Arab camps, they begin searching frantically for Abd al-Qadir Husseini, right? The leader of this army of the jihad, again, the dynamic, right? Popular figure, and they fear that he might have been captured or killed by the Jews in Castel. Word goes out to all the villages around the area. This huge Arab force storms Castel. The Hamas officers tell their men, right, you guys go, officers stay and fight, right? Well done, great stuff. The hill gets retaken. But it's too important, and they find the body of Husseini. Right, that was the guy who got shot by this one Jewish senator. But the Palmachniks know they need to take this hill. It's too important to leave in Arab hands. And the next day, the Palmach launches another attack on the hill, and they find it's empty. Right, one of these just remarkable things. When they found Husseini's body, a great cry of mourning goes up. His body's brought to Jerusalem for a funeral at Al-Aqsa. And all these villagers who had stormed the hill the day before now leave and go to Jerusalem for the Levaya, basically. And the Palmach is able to take the hill basically without a fight and now hold it. That same day, a far more controversial attack takes place at a village called Deir Yassin, which is a little closer to Jerusalem. So look, this is, again, controversial stuff. You know, on the one hand, it's often said, oh, the village is a peaceful village. They were in relatively good terms with a nearby Jewish settlement in, I think, Givat Shaul. The village elders had worked to keep out ALA fighters. But there is some question as to how the young men in the village felt about this. It does seem the village had just received a shipment of weapons from Egypt, which again, were they for defense? Were they for offense? Doesn't take much to go from one to the other. So certainly the Irgun said that the village represented a real threat to the reprovisioning of Jerusalem. Critics say that the revisionist militias just wanted their own victory to match that of the Haganah and Palmach. Whatever the case, the plan is for a sound truck to come to the village, right? Blare a warning, we're about to storm the village, right? Leave, surrender, you won't be harmed. The sound truck runs off the road. None of the Arabs hear the warning. And the Lehi and Irgun force launches an attack. Look, everything goes wrong. The resistance is a lot stiffer than had been anticipated. The Zionist militias are not trained for this. But look, these are guys who are used to shooting police officers and ambushing convoys and blowing up bridges. They're not accustomed to hand, right, in close urban warfare. And what a lot of the things these guys do is they basically do what you can do in this situation: slap explosive on the walls of buildings, blow a hole in a house, spray whoever's in the house with gunfire, move on to the next house. Ultimately, even with all that, the revisionists need help from the Haganah, which the Haganah later, sort of denies. So here's the question: what actually happened at Deir Yassin? The traditional account that came up right after the attack was that about 254 Arabs, many of them women, children, the elderly, are murdered. In recent decades, that number gets dropped to about 107. I just read a pretty convincing book, and I got to say, I read it thinking I would not be convinced, but the guy did a pretty good job. Eliezer Tauber, who's a professor of Middle Eastern Studies at Bar Ilan, has looked through all of, including the most recent memoirs, quotes, anything that have been declassified, things were written in the last few decades from people who were there, and gone through with pretty minute detail as to what happened over the 10-hour battle there. His conclusion is there were certainly murders of prisoners. There were certainly things that should not have happened. But what's the most convincing part is he goes through and as much as possible count for every one of those 107 people, how they died, where they died, and based on both Jewish and Arab accounts, and concludes that, yeah, well, perhaps a few dozen people were murdered in the course of the fighting. There was no overall massacre, but most people died because of the violence of the fighting. And I will point out that both Jews and Arabs during this period generally didn't take prisoners among young men. If you were a Arab and militiamen, you captured a Jewish village, you killed the young men. Same thing on the other side, because there were no prisoner of war camps that you could operate during the mandate. What's interesting then is the Deir Yassin myth and how it got started and how it was perpetuated. And what's interesting is everybody involved had an interest in making it seem as bad as possible. Arab propagandists hoped that the fears of Zionist victory, particularly Zionist rapes, in a very traditional society, would steal the resolve of male villagers, and they wouldn't abandon their villages. They'd fight because the prospect of a Zionist victory would be too horrifying. Haganah propagandists hoped to cast their rivals in the worst possible light. And revisionist propagandists saw the value in presenting this as bad as possible, because they began to realize very quickly that the Arab propagandists had seriously been miscalculated. Deir Yassin does not steal the resolve of Arabs to fight, it convinces them to flee. Because the prospect of a Zionist victory in your village or your town and the rape of your daughters and so forth was more than these people were going to put up with. And what seems to be the case is prior to Deir Yassin, from even before partition, from let's say October or September 1947 to April 1948, maybe 100,000 Palestinian Arabs had left. And this is the same pattern that happened in the 1930s. Wealthier Palestinians, those who had homes or businesses in other places, left, assuming they would come back when the violence was over, right? If I've got a villa outside of Beirut, I'm not going to stay in Haifa and get shot at, right? But 100,000, not large numbers, but often the leaders in these communities, right? Middle class, bourgeois, wealthy. Again, often people are prominent figures in very traditional communities, the kind of people who might have helped stop what comes next. After Deir Yassin, in the next 2 or 3 months, 250,000 to 300,000 Palestinian Arabs flee, including places like Jaffa, Haifa, where in Jaffa in particular, where the Irgun makes use of the Deir Yassin legend to help inspire further flight. The Irgun are launching attacks at Arab neighborhoods at Jaffa and spreading the word, you don't want to be here when this violence ends. Another repercussion of Deir Yassin is that it does seem to convince Arab leaders in other countries that they need to get involved. Deir Yassin is played up so much in the Arab world that no Arab government here can stand by and do nothing about it, including Emir Abdullah, the ruler of Transjordan, who was on pretty good terms with the Zionists. He was actually about to meet over a number of secret meetings. He'd had a number of them with Golda Meir to discuss some sort of non-aggression pact in which he would agree to only occupy the Arab parts and not go into the Jewish sections. And he feels that he has to now step in and take over the West Bank because of Deir Yassin. And by the time the mandate is set to end, the demographic and geographic realities of Palestine are swinging towards the Jews' favor, Some of the cities with the largest Arab populations have fled, Jaffa, Haifa, Sfat. The Zionist militias have taken over roads, they've taken over high ground, Things are moving positively in their direction. On May 14th, the mandate actually ends on Shabbos on May 15th, but because the Zionist leadership wants to declare independence and announce it before Shabbos, they do that on May 14th, and then of course, right, the next day the war breaks out. And this goes to, I think it was Steve who was asking before, the two narratives of the war, right? The traditional Zionist narrative is, right, little Israel miraculously survives the onslaught of an Arab world intent on destroying them. The anti-Zionist narrative is warmongering Zionists use their efficient war machine to ruthlessly ethnically cleanse Palestine. And as is often the case, the truth is somewhere in the middle. I will point out, and this is again part of the counter myth here, the Arab countries that enter this war were in most cases not much older than Israel, right? Lebanon, Syria become independent in 46. Egypt had just sort of ended the British occupation. Transjordan was still more or less a British, sort of satellite state. None of them had armies that were prepared for real warfare, with the exception of the Arab Legion in Jordan, and that was somewhat limited because they depended so much on the British. So, if you look at the actual numbers, the Arab forces in Palestine by the end of May were about 25,000. By the end of the year, about 65,000. The Zionists were in a much better position here. And I want to point out, to their credit, they had been building a state for decades. One of the things that to me is always a great way of looking at this is you think like in 1922 it was that the Jewish agency decides we need a Hebrew university. And you think about that, it's 1922. They're worried about getting enough chickens in Degania Aleph. Right. I mean, the number of little things that the Yishuv needs to survive in 1922, but they're planning a international university, right? And it's that mindset that explains what happens in 1948, right? Because they've been working on this. They have developed, and some of you who sat in on my organized crime lectures, they have developed an international arms acquisition smuggling network. Right, as soon as the state is declared, they can begin bringing in these guns legally. A disproportionately high number of Yeshivnikim have real military experience, right? Not just being military age, but real military experience. There were tens of thousands who had served in some capacity in World War II, in the regular British military, in the Jewish Brigade. When the war begins, some 3,500 to 4,000 Mahalmakim come, or these are foreign volunteers, Jews and non-Jews, who are going to bring real, again, experience with modern war. Unlike the Arab countries, women served in the Israeli military in some capacity as well. So even though the population is, not great, the population of military-age people with military experience and an ability to serve in the military is pretty considerable, right? So about 35,000 troops in May, again, mostly infantry of some sort or another. By the end of the year, they've got 96,000, which again is more than the Arabs do. And it's not just numbers, it's not just quality, it's quality, right? These are combat veterans in many cases. These are people who fought in World War II. They were pilots, they were tankers, they were paratroopers. Right. You have here Al Schwimmer, who helps build the Israeli Air Force. Mickey Marcus, many of you guys know about him, who writes like the first training manual for the IDF. The guy on the right, Tom Bowden, who is a British Army veteran who, again, had some Jewish girlfriends and had some bad experiences with the Germans in the war that led him committed to deciding to volunteer for the IDF afterwards. But these people bring things that, quite frankly, the Arab countries don't have, right? The Arab militaries are basically militaries that were designed to control a civilian population. The Jewish militaries are militaries that were designed, right, to win a war. This goes to this before the question about the 5 Arab countries, right? 5 Arab countries do declare war on Israel, but they're hardly unified. The Hashemite states of Iraq and Jordan, right, they have some common goals. They're both ruled by the same dynasty. But the Hashemites in particular, the Transjordanians, have no illusions about Israel's abilities. Abdullah basically wants to take the East Bank or the West Bank of the Jordan and Jerusalem, right? The family had previously controlled the holy sites in Mecca. Jerusalem was sort of like a consolation prize. So, right, that's his goal. He's not interested in, right, pursuing further conflicts. The Hashemites are rivals with the dynasty in Egypt, right, King Farouk, and you're going to see through the war that neither side is willing to help the other, right? If Farouk is failing, the Hashemites are happy. If the Hashemites are failing, right, Farouk is happy. Lebanon, which is dominated by Christians at this point, is pretty leery about the war and leery about Syrian intentions. They feel they have to join the war, but they're going to do as little as possible. And so there's not a lot of, right, actual collaboration between these groups. And the Arab leaders are not of one mind as to what this is going to, what the purpose of this war is, right? Some want to gain land, right? To this extent, Abdullah is probably the one with the clearest goal, but also one which is explicitly limited, right? Abdullah has no illusions about the Zionists. He has negotiated with them for a long time. He wants to take the West Bank. He wants to take Jerusalem. Beyond that, he's not interested in a war to destroy Israel. Some of the leaders, I think, probably hoped that the UN would intervene, right? Meaning they would fight the war, and at some point, international forces would stop the war, and they could sort of claim we did our part. And some of them just go to war because they had to, because they felt if we don't, we'll be toppled by our own people because we've sold this war. And even though we know the Zionists have a good chance of winning, right, our people think they're a bunch of Jews and it'll be a walkover. By contrast, particularly after June, the Israeli militias are unified, right? So the IDF sinks to Al Talina, right, kills a number of Irgunists and Lehi men there. Bitter time again. Begin, who had told his men to stand down during the season, tells his men to stand down in the wake of this, I would say, unnecessary attack. But the Zionist, but Israel, the IDF is unified. They have to win, and they have one command structure, one set of orders, and a pretty good incentive for doing well. So look, here's the thing. As I've said now to this point, it may seem like, oh, maybe it is the warmongering Zionists who started the war. They had better weapons, they had better training, they're unified. But I would say that number one, the fact that we can say today the Zionists were better prepared than the Arabs doesn't mean that that's what the Zionists necessarily thought, right? We know that Ben Gurion was worried about what the Arabs had. They thought they had more equipment than they actually did. So the Zionists, right, didn't think, oh, this is going to be a walkover. We're going to take whatever we want to. The Zionists couldn't have known how badly the Arabs would fight, how poorly prepared they would be. I point out that, what I think Steve said earlier, look, it is not a myth to say that you had 50 million Arabs against 600,000 Jews. The fact that those Arabs didn't mobilize, the fact that those Arabs didn't get their act together, the fact that the war didn't last longer than it did, well, Baruch Hashem, but these are not things that the Zionists necessarily knew would happen. Right? They hoped it would happen. They hoped that things would turn in their favor. They prepared for that. But the notion that they went into this war, considering all the other things they had to do, confident in, right, the kind of victory they had. I mean, they thought they would survive. I don't know how many of them thought that they would thrive as well as they did. And I point out that, look, every war is a bunch of small encounters. And the thing with the Zionists that also has to be kept in mind is they didn't have the luxury of the Arab states, right? Egypt could lose a battle and Egypt was not threatened, right? Jordan could lose a battle and great, they can bring in more troops from Iraq or Jordan, whatever it would be. The Zionists basically had to run the table, right? At any point, little engagements, this kibbutz, that hill, that village, if the Zionists had lost that, they could have lost everything. And I think one good example of this can be seen at the beginning of the war. Beginning of the war, Egypt invades Israel. And again, What were they trying to accomplish? Conquer Israel, destroy Israel, doesn't really matter for our purposes. But you've got a force of 2,000 men advancing to Tel Aviv, Israeli force of less than half that size. And that's something to keep in mind too. It doesn't matter if the Israelis have 35,000 men and the enemy has 25,000. If the Israelis have to spread those 35,000, right, over all these territories, they don't know where the enemy's going to attack. May 29th, right, so less than 2 weeks after the end of the mandate, Egyptians paused to set up a Bailey Bridge, right? It's if you see World War II movies, or you've probably seen them, they were made by like U.S. military engineers. They were like portable bridges you could, mount on a vehicle and actually very quickly build over a river. So all that's stopping between them and Tel Aviv is this river, and Israeli rivers are basically streams, right? This isn't exactly crossing, the Nile or the Mississippi here. And out of nowhere, 4 planes strafe the Egyptian army, right? These planes had literally just arrived from Czechoslovakia, right? They had been shipped in crates, right? Again, these have been purchased before the war, right? They arrive, Czech technicians assemble them basically on the runway, put them in the air, they fly off, right? They haven't even tested their guns. Some malfunctions, they lose one of the planes, one of the pilots. But the Egyptians, who had been told by their leaders that they had air superiority, that the Jews didn't have an air force, which a day earlier they didn't have an air force, so not incorrect, are stunned by this. And instead of crossing the river, they decide to dig in, which gives the Israelis time to, again, regain or gain the initiative. Now, this is not something that the Zionists prepared for, right? This is not a master plan to conquer Palestine or master plan to destroy the Arab armies. This was a whole lot of things happening at just the right time, sort of in desperation. And the Zionists depended heavily, like Blanche Dubois, right, on the kindness of strangers. Right. I now that I say it, I kind of like the idea of like Abba Eban, like, doing a Blanche Dubois while trying to convince the Americans to back Israel. Look, one of the things we're going to talk about in the next 2 weeks is the degree to which the Israelis have depended on great power protexia. They're not going to get it from Britain at this point. The French are not in any shape to act now, but hold that for next week. But they look to the Americans. Truman is being told by his Arabists in the State Department, don't side with the Jews. Truman's being told by the Jewish vote, side with the Jews. And again, Baruch Hashem, 1948 was an election year, right? Who knows what would have happened had the War of Independence begun in 1949. But the Americans are not interested, though, in providing arms in this. And it's worth pointing out, in 1948, the United States had a really good reputation in the Arab world. They were not an imperialist power in the Middle East. And so while certainly Truman does not want to see Israel fall, who knows what might have happened if that's the case, because election year, he's also not going to squander decades of goodwill in the Arab world, by sending guns to Israel. So that's not going to happen. The Soviets are another story, though. And the Soviets in 1947, 1948 go all in on backing Israel. And why is that the case? Somebody say it? Take a guess? Well,
Socialist state.
Okay, good. And not just socialist, but socialist in many cases from Russia, right? Right. Ben Gurion was a revolutionary in 1905, right? So if you are the Soviet Union, and keep this in mind too, most of the Middle East at this point is still dominated by British imperial states.
Feudalists.
Right? What's that?
They were feudal leaders.
Yeah, right. So if you are the Soviets and you're looking for any place where you can get a toehold in the Middle East, right? In a Middle East where monarchs still rule in Iraq, Jordan, Libya, Egypt, the Persian Gulf, where the British still control most of those monarchs, or the French still control North Africa. This is it, right? This is the best opportunity for the Soviets to disrupt things in the Middle East. And again, with a bunch of, a country led by a bunch of Marxists, right? Whether or not they're Bolsheviks, certainly Marxists. So they are going to go all in and give the go ahead for Czechoslovakia to start providing weapons to the Israelis. And as the war goes on, the material conditions of the Jews, of the Israelis, are going to improve considerably over that of the Arabs, right? So as soon as state is declared, Israelis begin bringing in weapons legally, including, as we've seen, aircraft. When a UN embargo is imposed on all the combatants, right? Well, keep in mind, Israel is far better prepared for this than her enemies. Number one, she had already developed a global arms smuggling network, right? I mean, all the stuff we spoke about too, with like, organized crime and all this other stuff. The Zionists and now the Israelis had a global network of people acquiring weapons, which we'll talk about in a minute. But also, she had developed her own small arms industry, which by the end of 1948 was producing much of her small arms needs. So if we look, we can get some sense. Czech imports through October 1948, right? Tens of thousands of weapons. Somewhat ironically, a lot of these were weapons the Czechs had actually made for the German military in World War II. Ethan, you might recognize some of these things. And I heard an interview once, it's pretty funny. Israelis got a shipment of rifles from Czechoslovakia. They begin trying to zero the rifles. They have to make slight adjustments on the sights to make sure they shoot straight. And they're just not shooting straight. And then they figure out that the sights had been intentionally misaligned, right? These had been rifles that the Czechs had made literally for the Wehrmacht and had sabotaged them. But now they end up being sent to the Israelis. Relatively easy fix. The Israelis are making their own weapons. Anybody know what this is here? What this young woman is carrying? Ethan, I'm looking at you, Ethan. Have you bowed out already? All right. This is something called a Sten gun. Okay. So the British make this in 1940. In 1940, the British are desperate. They need weapons, right? They left a whole lot behind in the beaches at Dunkirk. They need submachine guns. American-made submachine guns cost a few $100. Some bright boys in the British arms industry produced the Sten gun. In comparison to a Tommy gun, which is $200, this costs $11 to make, right? Stamped metal, easy to make, durable. The Israelis have been making them. Fires a 9mm round. Many of you have been here before. Anybody recognize this place? A lot of you, I'm sure, have been here. This is the Rehoboth Bullet Factory, right? Which was producing 9mm rounds. Right, so the Israelis are producing their own small arms, their own artillery shells, their own bullets, their own mortars, right? The famous Davidka mortar, which there weren't a lot of them, but they made a loud noise and scared the hell out of the people they shot at. Here are some planes smuggled in from the United States, which again, understand it's 1948. Literally, the world is full of war surplus, right? So this guy, Al Schwimmer, he buys B-17 bombers in the United States that have been stripped of all of their sights and weapons and so forth. Somewhere else, he buys the sights and the weapons. These planes fly to Czechoslovakia as cargo planes, right? He says, I want to start a cargo airline. So B-17s fly to Czechoslovakia. Israeli technicians mount weapons and sights and all these other things on them. They then fly to Israel, and on the way they drop some bombs in Cairo. Right, it's just like, as long as you're doing this, right, might as well cause some trouble there. P-51 Mustang, fantastic airplane. Again, Israelis buy some scrap and use them. Tanks. This is pretty cool. Actually, this is wrong. This is the before. That's the after. The Israelis barely have any tanks when the war begins. They have a couple of old obsolete French models from the 30s, but they begin looking and they find junkyards, right? Including junkyards in Palestine. where they're just wrecked tanks from World War II, right? Where they take some of these tanks, they might bastardize them, pirate the pieces here and there, and before you know it, they've got Sherman tanks. Not a lot, but they got something. They find in junkyards in Palestine. They find them in the Philippines. They find them in Italy, wherever they can. And by the time the war ends, the demographic and geographic realities have really shifted. You have now had hundreds of thousands of migrants coming in, some of them being thrown more or less, right into battle. Very early, the Druze in northern Israel accept the reality of Israeli victory and sit this one out. There are expulsions of Arabs from a number of places, right? Most notably around the Lida, where some 50,000 something Arabs are expelled. In other places, I do want to point out, they didn't have to expel the Arabs because they threatened them with massacres, right? So I do want to point out there were war crimes, not just, right, again, there certainly were murders, there were massacres, there were places where the Israeli forces would send a message to an Arab village, if you guys are here tomorrow, there'll be a massacre. With whether or not there would have been, don't know, because the Arabs took the hint and fled. Joel, this is the Canadian veteran I promised you. There actually would have been another mass expulsion from Nazareth. Ben Dunkelman, though, a tank commander from the Canadian Army serving Machal, was ordered to expel the population from Nazareth. He refused to. He said, look, they surrendered to us. We promised them they would not be mistreated. Joel, here's your Canadian. Here's your Canadian war hero.
God save the king.
God save the king, yeah. But yeah, if it had been for that, you would have got another, like, however many tens of thousands of Arabs expelled. The end result, though, was that Israel finds itself a state which is far more demographically and geographically defensible than what partition had offered. It was, again, a success which the Zionists certainly hoped for, though they perhaps could not have planned for. But I don't normally like spoilers, but spoiler, there's going to be some more wars. So you can come back next week. We'll hit 56. Much shorter class from now on. But any questions, comments?
Covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
There's I know I watched Exodus like 4 or 5 days ago. What the hell? And there's this thing.
Yeah.
This takes place in the north near Syria. That's where most of it is based. That's where the kibbutz is. But they have this thing where Nazis are advising the Arabs in the villages. In other words, so since you were talking about all the
you had
thing being Israel, I'm wondering whether there were Nazi anti-Semites who were trying to organize the Arabs.
Yes. Okay. So you had I meant to do this and then sort of lost the slide. So you had let's say 3 distinct groups. One, you had British deserters. So again, a few dozen British deserters had served sided with the Zionists. Between 1 and 200 sided with the Arabs, whether because they wanted payback or because they had girlfriends who were Arabs and convinced them to stay. You did have actual German, right, Nazis who saw an opportunity to cause trouble for the Jews, right? So there were small numbers of Nazis who served as advisors, and you also had a number of Muslims, Arabs, and Balkan Muslims who had served and been trained by the German military. So one of the things that the Mufti had done when he went to Germany in World War II was recruit Muslims, primarily Balkan Muslims, for a Waffen SS unit. But also they had provided training to Palestinian Arabs and other Arabs in the hopes that they could go back and sabotage and cause trouble for the British. So there will be small numbers of German and I guess local Nazis or people trained by the Nazis who provided support for the Arabs, but nothing nothing comparable to Machal. Like we're talking about again, like whether it's a few dozen or something like that. But there weren't like units of them. They were more like, again, advisors or, specialists.
I wanted to
And
point
none
out,
of them were as dreamy as Paul Newman.
yeah, well, that's
Yeah.
pictures. One other thing, well, two other things. The prison break in Acre, that happened before the partition, correct?
Yes, yeah. There was
It was an Irgun prison break, right?
yeah.
We
Yeah.
don't have to talk about it, but
No, I mean, it's fascinating stuff. But just again, like to me, it was just part of the whole like general Irgun thing. So again, it's very interesting from a political perspective. If you go to Acre and you go to the prison, first of all, it's I highly recommend it. Moving stuff, and again, just seeing the stuff. But also, they have what I think is very interesting a video there that they show, like dramatization of the prison break. That in some respects it's kind of like, okay, you kind of stole that bit from The Great Escape, right? That's like the Steve McQueen character, whatever it may be. But
right.
it was very clear to me. I could be very wrong. Maybe it's not clear at all. But it scanned very much like a video that was made like as the Likud became more obviously politically dominant, as again an effort to sort of reclaim the heroic Zionist past, right? To say, oh, we are going to turn, because it wasn't until the 1980s that the prison really became a tourist attraction, because its most important heroes were revisionists, right?
Right.
And to create this kind of monument to the role the Irgun played in this stuff, the Irgun and Lehi. So worth checking out in the video as well, which on the one hand shows like Irgunists and Haganiniks and Lehiniks all working together in the prison, right? So, but it's clearly like part of like, this is what we did.
Right.
I
I wanted to make one other comment, which this is an easy comment, but you were saying how if Egypt lost, they would just go back to Egypt. If Jordan lost, they would just go back to Jordan. In light of that, I have to mention that
Lebanon lost and go to Paris. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, this happened like immediately after the Holocaust. So the idea of surviving there is kind of, being invested, if you will, in.
Yeah.
I think that probably has also a large contribution, shall we say?
Yeah.
The fact that,
no.
Yeah.
Look, you see it. At some juncture, it's not because of like the inherent inability of Arabs to fight or any of this other sort of like anthropological stuff that comes up, but at some juncture, it's 1949, and you've got some Egyptian draftee who's being sent to charge, machine gun post by a kibbutz. That guy's got to be asking himself, why am I doing this? Whereas the people in the kibbutzim, they know why they're doing it, and right, they know that surrender is not an option, right? Those Egyptian soldiers, at some point, they're going to break because why not? Whereas the kibbutzniks, right, they don't have any option.
It's a controversial idea. I remember grade 6 in Jewish history, our teacher, he basically he talked about quote unquote the Arab mind, and apparently there's a book. I think it's is it Patai, like the anthropologist? That the quote unquote the Arab mind is incapable of
they're like big savage children.
Yeah, like incapable of facing reality and Orientalism in the bad sense of the term. But I remember this was actually just before the 6-Day War. He was teaching us this stuff. Again, it was propaganda. It was propaganda.
Well, and look, the problem with propaganda like that is, not too many spoilers, but you're going to see when we get to class on 73, a whole lot of the things that Israelis knew about Arabs between 67 and 73 proved to be disastrous misconceptions. Right. So, yeah, and I feel the same way about stuff. Now, whenever I hear, look, not related to the subject, my biggest fear for Israel is not a Palestinian state. It's a situation where the Palestinians say we don't want a state, we want Israeli citizenship. And whenever I hear somebody saying like, oh, well, the Palestinians would never do that, blah, 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 like, yeah, right. History is littered with people who made terrible mistakes based on what they knew the other side was going to do. So yeah, I find that stuff all to be very dubious and dangerous, quite frankly. Right? Not dangerous in like, oh, it's dangerous because you'll do bad things as other people. It's dangerous from an Israeli or Jewish perspective to operate under this constant sort of conception that like the other side isn't going to be as smart as you. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Thank you.
Yep.
Signing off.
And
Look
again, I
forward to
promise
next.
next week,
you.
much shorter. All right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Bye.
You see, he did.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a good week, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks.